Friday, June 28th. Business has been sort of slow all week. In fact, nothing happened since Mr. Apple's visit last Tuesday until today. Today I got a new product. I'm in the earthworm business now. So far it's been very profitable and quite interesting. The way it happened was that the garden needed cultivating. There were quite a few weeds in between the rows, and I suggested to Aunt Mabel that maybe I ought to get out the tractor and plow it. She agreed that the garden needed cultivating, but said that Uncle Al would probably feel cheated when he got home. "You go ahead anyhow," she said. "Al will just have to share his tractor this summer, now that he showed you how to use it." I got the tractor out, figured out how to attach the cultivator on the back, and plowed the whole garden twice in less than an hour. The tractor works like a dream. Just as I was finishing, a man in a dark blue car stopped at the side of the road and walked over to the fence. "Are you turning up any worms?" he asked. "Quite a few," I told him. "How about selling me a couple dozen?" I looked at him closely, and he looked perfectly normal. "You want to buy some worms?" I asked. "Sure, haven't you ever heard of selling worms?" "I've heard of selling snails and grasshoppers and rattlesnakes, but never worms," I said. "How do you cook them?" "You don't cook them at all," he replied. "I'm going fishing. Look, I'd sooner pay you 25 cents a dozen, say, than dig them myself. First place, I live in an apartment, haven't any place to dig. Secondly, it's just too much bother. You might take half an hour before you find the right spot. Sometimes you can't find any at all." The garden was full of worms, so I found a can, filled it with dirt, packed up about 2 dozen large worms. He gave me 50 cents and drove off perfectly happy. I decided immediately to go into the earthworm business. I had already made the change in my sign that Uncle Al had suggested, except that I had listed just turtles and pigeons. There was no point in saying that I had rabbits to sell until I had more than one. Midge and I tried 3 different times during the week to catch that rabbit, and each time he got away. I went to the basement to get the can of white paint and a brush so that I could add earthworms to my sign. On my way out of the house, Aunt Mabel called to me from the kitchen. "If you enjoy operating the little tractor, why don't you take the sickle bar and mow your lot?" she asked. "Al usually does it once or twice a year to keep the place from going completely to jungle." I unhooked the cultivator and hooked the 2-wheel cart on behind the tractor, put the sickle bar, paint, and brush in the cart, and drove off toward the lot. Agony, as usual, tagged along. Midge appeared about 10 seconds after I did, and immediately wanted to operate the tractor. She helped me hook up the sickle bar, and I made a couple of turns around the lot, and cut a swath about 3 feet wide. Agony kept running ahead of the tractor, so we had to tie him up. I was afraid I would cut off his legs. I mowed for about half an hour and then turned the tractor over to Midge while I added earthworms to our sign. She finished mowing about the same time I finished painting. Well, with the whole end of the barn just about covered with the sign, and all the grass freshly cut, we looked pretty snappy. "What are you going to keep the earthworms in?" she asked. "Dirt," I replied. "Yes, but you can't waste time going out and digging them every time someone wants to buy a few. Besides, when it gets dry, they go down so deep you'll have to dig all day to get them." "I know," I said. "What I need is something like a great big tub." "I'll tell you something we need," Midge announced. "A bale of straw for the rabbit's house. I cleaned it out this morning, but I didn't have any straw to put in it." "Where do you get straw?" I asked. "At Mr. Bain's farm," Midge said. "You go past your uncle's house, and a little ways down the road, there's a lane on the right. You turn down it, and he lives way back up in the field. Usually my father drives me down to get it, but we could go down in the tractor and cart." We detached the sickle bar and took it home and put it in the garage. Aunt Mabel said that it was all right to use the cart, so we drove off down the road. I drove the tractor, Midge sat on the seat in the little cart, and Agony sat in the cart itself. That dog would rather ride than do anything, even chase cats. Mr. Baines's farm was a sprawling old place with a white house and about 7 red barns. We had to hunt through all of them before we found him. We bought a bale of straw for 50 cents and put it in the cart, and were about to leave when Midge spotted an old bathtub sitting beside the masonry shed. "Are you going to use that bathtub, Mr. Baines?" she asked. Mr. Baines was a tall, lanky man with a long, crooked nose. He looked at Midge and said, "I doubt it. I got it about 6 years ago. Somebody gave it to me. I was going to use it for a watering trough. Then I couldn't find the right fittings to close that hole in the bottom, so I set it there. It's been there ever since. Do you want to get rid of it? Midge asked. You can have it, but I don't know how you can get home without a truck, Mr. Bain said. I'll bet that weighs a good 200 pounds. Don't you think it'll go in the cart? I asked. It's a little too long for that little cart, he said. He scratched his neck and then said, Tell you what, there's an old buggy in the machinery shed that I've been meaning to get rid of for some time. We'll load the bathtub into the buggy. You can hitch the buggy behind the cart and take the whole shebang. He called his hired men, and the three of us pulled and pushed and lifted, and finally we got the bathtub into the buggy. The buggy was really what you'd call a spring wagon, according to Mr. Baines, with one seat up front and quite a long body, so there was plenty of room for the tub. We found a piece of rope and tied the buggy on behind the cart. Since the cart was now filled with a bale of straw, there wasn't any place for Agony. He wanted to ride, so Midge picked him up and put him in the bathtub. That suited him fine. He stood up on his hind legs, put his front legs on the edge of the bathtub, and watched everything happily. Midge decided on the buggy too, and climbed up and sat down in the seat. It was a pretty heavy load for the tractor, and for a while I thought it wasn't going to pull it. The tractor was 3 gears, though. I managed to get started in low and slowly picked up speed. By the time we'd gone halfway down the lane, we were moving along at a fairly respectable clip. We reached the road, and I was able to turn left onto the blacktop without having to stop for traffic. There's a ditch behind my lot and the road, and just one narrow spot where there's a driveway over a metal culvert. I knew I would have to hit this fairly square, so I swung way over to the opposite side of the road and then made a sharp turn so I could go in the driveway straight. The tractor was just about to the edge of the road, with the cart and the buggy stretched out behind all the way to the opposite side, when Midge suddenly let out a yell and said, Stop! I jammed on the brake and killed the engine. What's the matter? I asked. There's a turtle right ahead of you, she said, standing up and pointing. You're going to run over it. I got off the tractor and picked up the turtle. I made 3 we have. A car was coming down the road, and I decided I'd better get out of the way, so I climbed back on the tractor. I pulled the starter wire, but the engine wouldn't start. I don't know what I did. Uncle Al says I must have flooded the engine. Anyhow, I did something, and it simply wouldn't start. The car that I'd seen drove up and stopped because it couldn't get by. Then one came from the other direction, and it had to stop. I kept pulling on the wire, trying to start the tractor engine, but it wouldn't even cough. By this time, there were 6 cars. Finally, 2 of the men got out and came over and tried to help me. They both tried to start the engine, and had no more luck than I had. Another 5 minutes went by, and another 5 cars stacked up in both directions. It was a few minutes after 5 o'clock, and people were on their way home from work. Ordinarily, there isn't much traffic along that road, but of course, this time there was. I was feeling sort of nervous and embarrassed about it all, but Midge didn't seem to mind. She still sat in the buggy, looking out over all the cars and waving to people she knew. Agony was in the bathtub, poking his head over the edge and barking first from one side and then the other. A man with a big camera was in one of the cars, and he came up and took 3 or 4 pictures. About 10 people tried to start the tractor, but it wouldn't budge. Finally, one man said, Look, we're liable to be here all night if we wait for mechanical power to get this rig off the road. Let's all take hold of it and we'll pull it off. Several of them pushed the tractor, 2 or 3 got behind the buggy, and several pushed on the cart. I sat on the tractor and steered. With so many people, it was no trick at all, and in 1 minute we had it rolled off the road and onto the lot. The man with the camera was taking pictures as we went. As the traffic jam cleared away, I looked over at the entrance to Mr. Apple's place, and there stood Mr. Apple and Mrs. Apple glaring at everybody. They were hoping somebody would trespass on their lawn so they could snarl at them, said Midge. We were well off the road, but I still wanted to get the bathtub over near the barn. I got off and gave 1 pull on the starter wire, and naturally the motor started immediately. I pulled the buggy over where I wanted the bathtub, and then Midge and I tried to figure out how to get it down from the buggy without smashing everything, including our toes. What are you going to put in that bathtub? A man asked. We turned around, and there was a man who had been taking all the pictures. Earthworms, I said, if I can get it off this buggy. He glanced at my sign on the end of the barn and then said, What are you going to do, give your earthworms a bath before you sell them? No, I just want a place to keep them, I said. I don't want to have to go digging up the entire lot every time someone wants a dozen. Well, I don't know why earthworms shouldn't be happy in a bathtub. Here, I'll give you a hand. Together we slid the bathtub off the buggy and over against the side of the barn. Then he took a picture of my sign and asked a lot of questions. I told him all about why I started the research business, that I wanted to be able to report on an example of free enterprise to my class back in Nepal. I also mentioned that I was having a little bit of trouble with one neighbor who was complaining that I had violated the zoning law. He seemed very sympathetic and wished both Midge and me success. He shook our hands and promised that he would buy all his earthworms from us.